Thompson with Soil³ and welcome back to day 2 or part 2 of the backyard vegetable gardening live stream with Soil³. Today is the spring edition inside version. It is 44 degrees out. It is also raining and it looks like it's going to be storming later. So we are all vaccinated and decided just to swoop everything indoors and be warm and safe and cozy. Today, Chris and Brie are going to present 2 hours of lectures. Chris is going to start us off with Everything Okra, fascinating subject. I've read his book. You're in for a treat with this program. And Brie is going to finish up with Foodscaping with Grains. I've also read her grains book. I never gardened with grains before, so I promptly started sowing wheat and rice and all sorts of grains all over the place, oats, and she'll tell you more about that at 12:30. Also want to reiterate, like I did last time, that we do have the comments section turned off. We've noticed that people tend to chat and ask questions, many of which are going to be answered by the speakers. If just listen and sit back and enjoy and absorb and daydream about your garden and what you're going to do next. Take some notes and absorb the material. Let's not be multitasking. We'll wrap up Monday by sending you links to these presentations so you can watch them again. And again, if you'd like, you can share them with your friends. We'll also be sending a coupon for a discount to everybody who's registered. So thanks for coming back today. Take us away, Chris.
Hey, glad to be back and talking about my favorite crop, which is okra, and I'm really excited to have the opportunity to share a deep dive into a specific vegetable, and hopefully I'll be speaking to people that have never grown okra before and want to learn more, but we'll also have stuff for people that have grown okra. I used to promise that when I talked about okra you would learn something that you didn't know about okra, but now I've been talking about okra for a long time, so I'm kind of scared that I'm not going to say that anymore, because maybe you already know everything that I know, or maybe you read the book. And have I learned anything since writing the book? I have. I'm always learning new things about okra, and that's one of the things that I'm so excited about, is this rabbit hole that I've been down for the last 5, 6 more years, exploring okra in all its diversity and depth. Just keeps getting deeper and deeper and deeper, and I feel like it's led me to connect with so many excellent people. So very happy to be sharing all this information with you today. We are going to focus on the gardening aspect, so I'm going to go through to make sure that if you are new to growing okra or have some basic questions about how to grow okra better, we're going to cover all that stuff in a good amount of detail. But then, halfway, 2/3 of the way through the presentation, we'll flip a little bit and do some of the more exciting aspirational stuff that I've discovered and explored and learned in my own journeys with okra. So I'm going to share some of that with you. So that means if you happen to be watching and you don't currently like okra, then you should definitely watch all the way through to that section, because I think we could find a way for you to engage with okra that is not just that green pod that we all know and some of us love and some of us don't. Okay, let's jump into it. The book was written in 2018, and in 2019 it was published, and in 2020 it won the James Beard Award, and I just wanted to lay down that kind of rapid journey that I've been on. It's now 2021, and I'm just getting set to work with a research assistant who's helping me with the Utopian Seed Project, which is the nonprofit I work for. He's helping me. We're currently planting 100 different varieties of okra, so we've got a lot of stuff to share and get into. And like I say, the okra journey is ongoing. I like to start with this slide. 1, to introduce some of my family. 2, because it makes me giggle, and I want to share that with you. But also to recognize 2 of these wonderful quotes I found in some of my research. One is the fact that it kind of references, it's a Turkish proverb where it says, if you're gonna grow okra, then expect to spend a lot of time away from your family, because it's so productive and grows so much food, which is one of the reasons I love it, that you're gonna spend a lot of time with your okra and maybe not a lot of time with your family. So that's one side of things. The other is a single finger can't harvest okra or pick okra. And that's a Haitian proverb. And I love that this speaks to kind of the community aspect of a lot of the work that I do with the Utopian Sea Project, and that together, not just okra, but a whole bunch of different vegetables can take us in so many different directions. And so I'm very keen to not just share the knowledge, but share the seeds. We talked about seed saving yesterday, and you get this awesome return on seeds. So if you plant one seed, you can get hundreds, thousands back, and then you can share them. And I think together we can shift the food system in a more community-orientated way. And just to kind of, I guess I can't just show that picture and leave it there without actually explaining what's going on. Okra is way more than just a green pod that we eat, to me, or in the South, deep fry and pickle and sometimes gumbo. This is based on a Zimbabwean tradition that I found, where the very dry climate tends to dry out the skin, and they take the okra pods and they boil and blend them and then use it as a face mask. So this is literally okra slime on their faces. And I persuaded my wife, Belle, and my then 3-year-old daughter Emily to have a spa treatment day. I had to give them foot massages and all sorts to persuade them to allow me to put green okra slime on their face. The cross-section of the okra was my special touch, so I didn't read that in a book. And Emily kind of smiled for the photograph and then said yuck and ran away, but my wife stayed there for the recommended 5 minutes and really said that okra, and we're going to speak a little bit about the mucilage within okra, really felt like it hydrated her skin. And we actually find that it turns up in a couple of different hair conditioning products and skin products, and more you're starting to see that quality of okra being brought into different cosmetics. And the reason I know my wife, Belle, actually enjoyed it was because I had this whole jar of okra gloop, and she asked me to put it in the refrigerator so that she could use it later. So I think, that's just an early insight into some of the places I've gone and dragged my family with okra. Okay, so to get serious, or not actually, this is a celebrity chef, and I've used the slime in creative ways. Other people have celebrated the slime, but it's one of the things that kind of puts a lot of people off. And when I first came to America and started engaging with okra, I kept on butting up against this pushback where people would basically say, ooh, I hate okra, it's slimy. And so that was some of my original inspiration, was to kind of say, well, actually, yes, it's slimy, but there's all these other wonderful things about okra. I was like a child when I first came to okra. I was 26 when I first experienced okra, and really just fell in love with it very quickly and couldn't understand this pushback. And so this is some famous people saying bad things about okra. We have Tom Colicchio. I hate okra and grated mountain yam for the same reason. They are both slimy. Fairly common criticism. Julia Reed is a Southern writer who actually likes okra, but she wrote, so few people eat okra, more radishes are grown in this country, that it never even makes it onto the lists of the top 10 most hated foods. So that's a pretty low blow to say it's so terrible, it's not even going to be rated on the terrible food lists. And it's actually not true. I found so many different hated food lists that included okra as well. So it's just has a bad rap, a bad reputation, which is pretty sad. And then this is the one that hurts me the most. The late Robin Williams said, okra is the closest thing to nylon I've ever tasted. It's like they bred cotton with a green bean. Okra tastes like snot. The more you cook it, the more it turns into string. So we have to give him a little bit of credit, because he did get close to botanically right. Okra is related to cotton. It's in the same Malvaceae family. And if you boil it, it does kind of become stringy, but there's so many other things you can do with the pods beside boiling it that we will get to shortly. So this is the flip side, and the last quote before we get into some of the gardening know-how, and forms the basis for a lot of what I believe agriculture needs to be and do. This was actually written in the 70s, so it's not a new idea, but we can read here, the desirability of cultivating multiple purpose crops cannot be overemphasized. For crops that can produce several kinds of useful products make efficient use of land. The pressure imposed by expanding populations and higher standards of living will force us to produce food, feed, forage, fiber, foliage, and fuel on increasingly limited land resources. So that's a big concept, but it's basically saying we need to do better with our food production and all our other needs. And written in the 70s, specifically in a book about okra, suggesting that okra has this capacity to be not just a dual purpose crop, but like a quattro, multiple purpose crop that can achieve lots of our needs in one single planting. And that's where okra becomes this champion, this seed to stem celebration of okra that can offer so much in the garden beyond the green pod. So let's get a little bit into the gardening so that you can truly grow it yourself, and then we're going to swing back to this seed to stem idea just to more expansively look at all the different things that you can do with okra. So 2018 was my first, I'd been growing okra since I moved to America in 2012. 2018 was my first large grow out. We did about 76 varieties that year, and part of my initial aim in growing that many varieties was just to kind of have proof of concept that true varietal diversity existed within okra, because traditionally we're kind of shown, a green pod. I go to a lot of conferences and speak to people about okra, and they're usually like, oh yeah, there's two okras, there's a red and a green okra, and then we know there's a few different shapes, but is there like real varietal diversity? We know in tomatoes, everyone gets excited about all the different heirloom tomatoes. What about okra? So that was one of my questions. You could see it pretty early in the field, sometimes before the pods even came through for production, because the plants were all different, so we had different shapes and sizes and colors there as well, and it was really magical to see everything all in one place. And this, Franny's Farm, is where I continue to do my work with the Utopian Seed Project, so we have ongoing trials at this location. In the same year, I did a random red variety trial at a friend's farm. You can see my 4-month-old helping me out on my chest, taking notes. The random red was inspired by Seed Savers Exchange that have a massive list of different okra varieties, but a lot of them were red okra 48 and red okra this number and that number, or just random red, and they had all these okras and no descriptions, just from people donating okra to their seed bank. So I decided to pull out all those red varieties and grow them together to try and get a handle on what all these red ones were all about. Again, we see beautiful diversity in the different reds. Some of these have gone on to become my favorite, and we've grown them out and got them with descriptions in seed catalogs. The most amazing part of this random red variety trial was this top left one, which was called Red Wonder. And the only wondrous thing about it is that it's obviously not red. So I still don't know the story behind that one, despite it having an excellent name and only green pods. Who knows? But a lot of variety diversity in shape, size, color, and flavor, which we'll get to in a minute. And then this is the 60 varieties that were at Franny's Farm. It was really heartwarming when I started harvesting them all and going, I kind of knew it, but it proved it in my mind that we really had that kind of like tomato level varietal diversity within okra, which gave us way more to explore and celebrate and talk about. Oh, and I include this one in here just because yesterday we talked about seed saving and selective seed saving and your ability as a home gardener to very easily and accessibly take any planting of a single crop, in this case okra, and look at all those plants and see the micro differences or the things that impress you most about the plant. And sometimes it can be quite intuitive. You can kind of just fall in love with a plant, and why is that plant more special than the rest? You can trust your instincts on that level and just save seeds from your favorites and develop your own regionally adapted or self-adapted variety over time. And so this is a wonderful project where I was given a bunch of seeds from Seed Savers Exchange, and somewhere along its heritage it had been all mixed up, and the only information we had that it was a mid-1800s variety called Whidbey White, and they wanted me to select it back towards the palest pod. And so in the first year of growing it, we see it was throwing up real pale pods in the middle, but it was also throwing up all these other genetics. And so over the last 3 years, we've been selecting those pods just to save seeds from the palest ones to try and bring this old-timey variety back on track. And in the 1800s, there's a lot of agricultural texts that speak about the white okras, the pale okras being like the supreme okra, the best tasting, the most tender okras. And there was this period in American agriculture where some of these white varieties were really held above the rest and really enjoyed. And so we see some good white varieties coming out of the 1800s, but this one was kind of lost its course, and we're swaying it back on track. And this year, we are doing a large community seed selection effort where the Utopian Seed Project has sent about 260 different people packets of this improved variety, and they're helping me select pale pods to then send the seeds back to me so we can advance this variety back to where it once was. So many fun things to do with seeds and okra, and I hope you can stay in touch and stay engaged. Okay, and then before we get straight into growing details, I want to give you my 2 favorite varieties. And I say favorite loosely because I'm always changing and enjoying different things, but these are certainly in my top okras that I grow every year. One is Antetti's Red, which is this beautiful dark red podded variety. It's available in a couple of seed catalogs. Victory Seeds and So True Seed definitely sell it. And one thing we do every year with these okras are these taste tests, these culinary evaluations to see which ones taste best. And you may not think of okra having lots of different flavor profiles, but it does have like nuances in flavor and texture. And we ran a taste test in 2019, and this variety, Antetti's Red, in 3 different cities with a whole bunch of chefs being involved, came in the top 4 in 3 different taste tests. So we can pretty confidently say that this is a very tasty okra. So if you're just growing something like red burgundy, it's a good variety, it's a well-known variety, but maybe try something a bit different, and this would be a recommendation. And then this is a variety that I'm currently working on. So this comes back to that seed selection. The USDA, now a lot of people don't know this, but the USDA houses a whole bunch of different varieties. They've got gene banks all over the country, and anybody can go and look at that information. It's called the GRIN, the Genetic Resource Information Network. So you can go online and just look at all these different varieties. And if you go to that website and search okra, you'll find that the USDA has over 1,000 different varieties of okra in their gene banks. And so as part of our work, we start pulling out these varieties, some of which are only named with a number from a country. They're collected from all over the world from different plant collection expeditions. So we pulled out Puerto Rican Evergreen just because we were selecting okras to try from different parts of the world. And it turned out that this was one of the varieties I fell in love with. And it was early, it was delicious, it was productive, it was beautiful, it started ticking all the boxes of things I love about okra. But it had this diversity. It wasn't just like a singular phenotype. The way the plant expressed itself was not uniform. And so over the last 2 or 3 years, we've been selecting to bring the okra onto like a single phenotype, which is this. This is the one I'm going for. So a smooth, round pod with red blushing on tall, red stalked plants to maintain that delicious edible quality and the velvety fuzz instead of the spines that you sometimes get with okra. So this one isn't available, but keep your eye out on this one, and we're going to release it soon. And it's just we can have an expansive future of where okra can be in the not too distant future. It's just a picture of one of our taste tests we do. 48 different varieties and a bunch of chefs in the room and lots of people eating okra, and it's pretty fun. We do the taste tests raw just because it's really hard to conceive how you would uniformly cook 48 different varieties and present them to chefs. And okra is delicious raw, so it's not a bad way to eat it. Okay, so growing. What does okra need? What does okra love? All you really need to do is look at this map and realize that these are the countries of highest okra production, and they're all across that kind of tropical, subtropical region. So okra is a heat-loving plant. If we were to try and hunt back the botanical origins of okra, there is some debate around this, but it's most likely East Africa. There's definitely some diversity within okra that exists in India. India is currently by a long way the largest okra producing country. So kind of India, Asia, East Africa, most likely origin, and then it's traveled across, and it's all throughout tropical Africa. And we see it arriving in the Americas much later. It comes across from West Africa with the slave trade and then lands in Brazil, and then works its way up through the Caribbean and into South North America, so ports of Charleston and New Orleans. And then we have it in the South, and by the mid-1700s, we're seeing it grown in Philadelphia and that kind of thing. So that's its kind of progression throughout. But anywhere where you've got good hot conditions, you're going to be able to grow okra. People are growing okra much further north. Nova Scotia, people trying to do it in British Columbia, Pacific Northwest. Varying degrees of success. Most people that are being successful with it are doing selective seed saving and taking varieties and saving the seeds from the surviving plants and then planting those survivors to try and select okra to be productive in cooler climates. But it's not where it's the most happy, even though it's possible. So while this also, I've just noticed it says Little Egypt. It shouldn't say Little Egypt, but we'll get to that slide soon. So while we see okra grown all across these different regions, keep in the back of your head that that also means there's going to be culinary diversity that's represented across all those regions. So as we get into the section at the end where we're going to talk a little bit about food stuff, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about eating the pod because there's a lot of information out there on that. But if you are bored or don't like some of the traditional southern preparations, just look outside of the southern United States and you'll see a multitude of preparations around okra, and there's so many delicious recipes and cultures and cuisines out there that you can experiment with. Okay, so I think okra is relatively easy to grow, so what we're going to focus on is some of the common pitfalls that people come across or common questions that I get asked to help you be more successful. But once it's actually up and growing, it pretty much looks after itself. So the first thing we come across as a potential problem is germination. People have germination issues with okra. One thing to recognize there is when you buy a packet of seeds, the seed company selling those seeds has to have those seeds germination tested. So you are buying seeds that have recently been germination tested to make sure that we know a certain percentage of those seeds are germinating. And the pass rate of those seed germination tests is all governed by a federal seed act. And they say tomatoes have to pass at 80%, I don't actually know the numbers of tomatoes, but there's different numbers attached to different crops. And quite often they're fairly high. With okra, it's 50%. So a seed company could sell you a packet of seeds that's recently passed a germination test at 55%, which means only half of your seeds in that packet would grow. And that reflects the fact that okra doesn't have great longevity as a seed. Some seeds can last a long time. Okra doesn't have great longevity as a seed, and therefore we traditionally see slightly lower germination rates, and that's reflected here. So don't be totally disheartened if not all the seeds in your seed packet grow. Just, overplant. Usually you have way more seeds than you could grow anyway, and just plant 2 or 3 seeds per either straight into the ground or in containers. So that's one thing. The other thing is, we've already said that okra is this heat-loving plant. The seeds especially love to have warm soil to germinate, and that's really critical. And what this chart is telling you, and it's just one chart and one experiment, so I wouldn't be locked into these specific numbers, but you can see the trend that as the soil temperature increases and gets warmer, we see a germination rate that's correspondingly getting better. And then the days to emerge, so from planting that seed to when it comes up, also that length of time shortens. It's often the case that a seed will germinate in a wide range of soil temperatures, as we're seeing here, but if it takes 3 or 4 weeks for that seed to come up, then as gardeners, certainly in our modern, fast, crazy world, we're not willing to wait 4 weeks for a seed to come up, and we've probably said, oh, it's not good, and dumped it. And this can also be variety dependent. I've had some seeds that have been planted in identical conditions, but different varieties, and some of them come up within a couple of days, and some of them take a couple of weeks. So every seed, there's a lot of diversity within okra and plants in general, and they're not all going to behave extremely uniformly, especially with some of these old-timey varieties. So just bear that in mind, be a little patient with your seeds. But this gives you an idea of the optimal, we're definitely looking to get into the 70s for soil temperature. 68 would be a minimum in my mind, but even then you're getting slower days to emergence. So if you can push into the 70s, you're going to have quick emergence and a better germination rate, which is what we want. And then alongside that, and this is kind of like a deeper lesson here to some extent, we're seeing what you're seeing here is a whole bunch of different seed treatments. And so I used to go around all the different agricultural conferences, and I had a box that I put on my table, and it said, hey, I'm writing a book about okra, come and speak to me. And about 50% of the people would walk by and just go, ooh, you're okra, and walk off. And I thought that was kind of rude. But about 25% of the people would come and talk to me about the favorite way they like to eat okra, which was generally roasted. Roasted okra is like the #1 okra hater converter. So if you need that little tip and you want to convince your spouse or your friend or whoever to eat okra and they don't like it, then roast it in like a hot oven so that it goes a little bit crispy. So, a little bit of oil and salt, and it just blisters a little bit and browns, and it'll disappear from the plate, especially if you have like a garlic aioli type dressing that they can dip it in. Anyway, that was a tangent. These conferences, I'd have this box, people would come and speak to me, and a lot of people liked to share the way that they got okra seeds to germinate. And so I started having this long list of, oh, you have to do this. You have to soak it in bleach. You have to soak it overnight. You have to soak it in cold water. No, you have to soak it in boiling water. No, you have to freeze it. No, and there was just this, and in like traditional gardener ego land, then because it's the thing that they did, it was the only thing that could be done. And I was like, hang on. No, this can't all be true because I've never done any of this and I've always managed to grow okra. And so I decided to take the main ways that people told me that they swore by for seed treatments and just run side by side, very simple kitchen counter trial, and took 2 different varieties and did these different seed treatments on the left, and then just put them in germination bags, just Ziploc bags and damp cloths, just to see how quickly and how many of those seeds germinated. And the basic takeaway is pretty much everything works. So that's the moral lesson. Just because your way works doesn't mean somebody else's way doesn't also work. But then if we really had to hone in on it, then bleaching was quick, but it uses bleach and it smells, and it wasn't any better than soaking in cold or tap warm water. So because okra seeds are big and all seeds need to imbibe quite a lot of water before that will trigger germination, then I do recommend, and I do this myself, I do soak my seeds prior to planting, just because I think it helps prevent some common problems. I don't do this with all seeds, but with okra seeds being a little bit big. And Brie spoke yesterday in seed starting about the need to scarify some seeds. And there are some people that literally will nick or take some toenail clippers and clip the edge of that hard seed coat of okra to improve germination. But as Brie said in that presentation, the easiest way to scarify a seed is just to soak it overnight, because it just softens that hard outer coat, allows it to imbibe all that water, and then you can often get better germination that way. So that would be my takeaway. Just soak it overnight. It's the easiest, less invasive thing to do. If I'm doing a bigger planting, direct seeding without soaking is totally fine, but just keep that in the back of your head that the seed does need water and it likes to have consistent water through germination. So if you were to direct seed, water it in, and then have 3 days of dry weather, you're probably not going to have very good germination from that seed. So, and that's a general rule for starting seeds, is if they dry out during germination, you're going to have issues. Okra even more so because it's a big seed. Okay, and then the other question that we see comes up with okra is, do I transplant, do I not? So I wish it was like a real simple answer so you can make your own decision. I'm going to give you the information, you can make your own decision. I do also like what Brie said with this, in that if I can get away with not transplanting, like starting in pots and then transplanting into the garden, I will do that every time because it's less resources, less space, less time, less chance for things to go wrong, like in terms of forgetting to water, temperature spikes, and it's just easier to go out into the garden and put a seed in and have it grow into food than to faff around with all the transplanting stuff. So if I can get away with it, I will always direct seed. And I used to direct seed okra religiously and have no problems. There's a counter to this, but before I tell you that, I want to explain Seed Savers Exchange had this same question, or we spoke one year and they decided to do a test. And they were like, well, is direct seeding better than transplanting? Because they had always previously transplanted. And so they're always doing lots of different variety trials, and they took half of every variety they were planting out, I don't know what their total variety was, and they transplanted half of them, and they direct seeded the other half. And they all germinated, and they all grew, and the okra patch was kind of looking good. And then they had a summer storm come through, and it was a pretty rough storm, and the next day they noticed that every single transplanted okra had fallen over, like lodged, like, and was no good anymore. But every single direct seeded okra was still standing strong. So that's a pretty significant, depending on your climate, observation that if you direct seed it, then there's something that happens that gives the okra better root development. And better root development can lead to better drought tolerance because it's more able to pull up water, and better nutrient scavenging abilities as well. So root development is really critical, especially if you're not irrigating or applying additional fertilizer. So bear that in mind. So far I'm telling you everything that says you should direct seed. The flip side of this, or the reason you might want to transplant, is that if you transplant okra, you will almost invariably get okra earlier. I have a farmer friend in Shelby, North Carolina, that basically says, if you want okra by the end of June, beginning of July, you pretty much have to transplant okra, because we're looking at about 55 days to harvest, and so if we're transplanting after that danger of frost, when there's definitely not going to be anything that can kill it, so that mid-May date in this region, then we're not going to be getting okra until mid-July. And if you want that early harvest, which is really good for market farmers and people that really, really love okra, then if you transplant some of it, you're going to get much quicker okra than if you direct seeded. So that is a pretty strong counter argument. And maybe in the home garden, you can kind of like, plant an early crop. And again, Brie talked about succession planting. You could do an early crop and then a direct seeded crop that would come in later and potentially be more able to withstand that summer temperature and drought periods that we sometimes get. So hopefully that kind of gives you some information to make good decisions yourself, but it will depend on what you're trying to achieve. And then this slide kind of backs up some of that root stuff. This is like a root excavation project that was done end of the 1920s. And what it really speaks to is how amazing okra is. This picture down here on the right, that is the root system in early development. So it's 3 weeks old, this plant. The top plant is only 5 inches high. And each of those squares represents a 1-foot block. So we're seeing an 18-inch taproot on a 5-inch seedling. And then we also have like almost 24 inches lateral spread of root systems all the way around. And that's pretty incredible for a small plant. We see very early root development, which speaks to drought tolerance and the ability for okra to be a nutrient scavenging crop. Fast forward to maturity when we first start harvesting, so about 8 weeks, and we're seeing the same kind of scale used, so we've got 1-foot blocks. We have a 4.5-foot taproot on this, and I'm 5'7", so kind of down to the floor taproot, and then we're seeing, I'm 5'10" lateral spread in all directions. So this is like an breaking the flowers. This is an unrestricted growth of okra roots, and that's what it wants to do. So just incredible root system. that speaks to some of the more recent research using okra as a cover crop to combat compacted ground and injecting high amounts of organic material into the ground. So a good cover crop option for the summer, but also continues to support this idea that one, we kind of know why okra doesn't really like to be transplanted, because it wants to bust its roots out, and we're putting it in a little pot. So if you are going to transplant, let's talk about 2 to 3 weeks before planting out, certainly no more, because the roots are just going to get out, like, root bound really quickly and not be able to do what they want to do, which is probably why Seed Savers Exchange had all theirs fall over. The root system was never able to catch up with that early development that it wanted to do while you had it contained inside a pot. So I think that's pretty fascinating. I'd love to replicate this with some modern varieties, but still pretty good data. Okay, so this is my container grown okra. The question always comes up, can we grow okra in containers? Hopefully from seeing that last slide, then you can kind of answer that question yourself. So it's not that we can't grow okra in containers, but okra doesn't really want to be contained. And actually from the 1 year that I tried to grow okra in a container, I found out that yes, you can grow it in containers, but you literally can't contain it, because what happened with my okra, I had it in a 5-gallon bucket and I had drainage holes in the bottom, and it grew and it wasn't that happy. It produced pods that were edible, but it wasn't very productive. Not too surprising for container grown stuff. Generally, it's not going to be as productive as field grown. But it got to kind of close to the frost season, and I was thinking I was going to be all clever and pick up my bucket and put it in my greenhouse to get a couple of extra weeks of production. And the bucket was welded to the ground, and I literally could not lift it off the ground. And I went and got a spade and excavated it, and got about 2 foot down before the taproot broke. And what you can actually see here is the okra root grows. It goes through one of my drainage holes, and then on the other side it re-fattens out and grows a deep taproot way into the ground. And you're seeing a little bit of that lateral spread, even though it was contained within a 5-gallon bucket. So if you're going to grow okra in containers, then grow it in a big container would be my takeaway. And I've not done a lot of that myself, but I would be interested to see what sort of production people can get based on the size of the container. But definitely bigger than a 5-gallon bucket is what I'd go for. And this was actually Little Egypt I put up there, because that's a dwarf variety. So there's been some breeding work done to bring the height of the okra plants down, and this one tops out at about 2 feet. I've actually got one variety that's about 1 foot tall, but puts on full-size pods and has really small interstem nodal production, and it kind of just puts on real dense leaf production all the way up, but never gets much taller than about that. And there's a guy in Texas doing some breeding work to try and breed a container grown okra, but he's had similar results to me. Okay. So ideally have your okra in the ground. You can see here that while some okras will grow short, some of them will grow incredibly tall. I tend to measure the height of my tallest plants. We had a plant last year that was up to about 14.5 feet, which isn't, you hear a lot of those sort of tales down like in the deep south, Alabama type area, Louisiana. But North Carolina, I don't often see plants that are that tall, but they'll easily get up to 8, 9, 10 feet, depending on the variety. Harvesting can be a total pain once it gets that high. You have to kind of bend the whole stalk down and clip them, and it takes a long time. So there was one gentleman reported on in an Alabama newspaper from the late 1800s that got so fed up with harvesting okra from the top of these tall plants that he used to sit in his field with a shotgun and try and shoot the pods off. I don't think that's a good idea, but that's what he did. One maintenance practice that you can do is go in and literally top the okra. So you can top it at whatever your harvest height is, maybe 5 feet, 6 feet. And by topping that lateral growth, you can inspire much more lateral development and get kind of like more intense development further down. So that's definitely a maintenance practice that some people do. In much warmer places, they do this in India, southern Florida, you can go in and level okra just above the ground. It's called ratooning. You go in and cut it off, and then it'll literally regrow from the bottom of the stem, and you'll effectively get a new okra plant and fresh production with a little bit of downtime while it's regrowing. So that's one thing that people often do through the hottest of the hottest period. You'll get like spring production, ratoon it, and then fall production. I haven't done that myself. Our season isn't quite long enough to get away with that, but there's lots of reports talking about that sort of thing. So to get into actual harvesting, there's a few things that come up. You know, when we're eating okra, people complain about the slime. When we're harvesting okra, people complain about the spines. These leaves on the okra plant are covered in these dense trichomes that will irritate the skin. It was actually in this field, lots of people talk about how terrible this is, and I decided to harvest the entire field short-sleeved just to try and, I wanted to write about it. And it was horrible. It's intensely horrible. Like by the time I got to the end of the field, I live about 5 minutes away, and I jumped in my car and I had like white knuckles driving home, trying not to like tear off my skin. And I can now personally say you should wear long sleeves and gloves when harvesting okra, because that trichome okra itch is real and painful. But I also found out, I used to work with kayaks and do fiberglassing, and the fiberglass itch is terrible too. And just like baby lotion moisturizer always seemed to work on fiberglass, and it also seems to work with the okra itch. So that's kind of like one of my personal discoveries. So long sleeves definitely when harvesting. For some reason, this is anecdotal, but has been supported by other farmers I've spoken to, when it's wet, the itch seems to be worse. So like I used to do super early morning before I got hot harvesting, and the itch was always worse than I harvested in the day. So now you're balancing, do I want to harvest a bunch of okra when it's 90 degrees and humid as hell, or do I want to do it early in the morning when it's cool, but the itch is much worse? So I do get the complaints around harvesting okra, but I don't think that should limit you from growing okra. So a few things you can do. Nat Bradford is a South Carolina farmer that has a family heirloom of okra, and he grows his rows nice and tight, and he goes and chops all the bottom leaves off. So he chops all the bottom leaves off to kind of create a more open space for harvesting and walking down those paths. So that was his intention, but the unintended consequence was by taking all those leaves off, it bumped his peak production to like crazy levels. And so we learn with okra in the scientific literature that it has this kind of like traumatic response to harm. And if you whack off all the leaves, or what the old timers used to do is pay kids like a nickel to run through the okra fields, switching okra they called it. So they take a stick and just whack the okra, which kind of seems mean, but what it does, it inspires the okra to be more productive. So you can kind of do fairly harsh leaf maintenance to get rid of some of that itchiness or itchy producing leaves, and also get better pod production at the same time. So I thought that was pretty cool technique. And then to get finally, so you do all these things, but definitely wear long sleeves. Once you actually get into the field and start harvesting pods, the big question that comes up is when do I harvest them? Because people will joke that you have to, you look at it 1 minute and the next minute it's already long and woody and it's not edible. Or you go away on a family vacation and you come back and your entire field's just full of woody pods, or even just a weekend it can be like that. So some things to know about the pods and when you're harvesting them, all sorts of rules of thumb, one of which is the okra should be about as long as your thumb when you harvest it. It's so variety dependent that I don't actually get too caught up in actual length measurements. But there's this snap trick, and I have a picture a little further on that I'll come back to, but when you see your okra pod, in fact I've got one, this is not very good for eating, but you can see your okra pod is grown, and they all have a tip on them. And if you just take that tip between your finger and thumb and were to snap it like that, like fairly quick action, then if it snaps clean, then the okra's good to go. And it doesn't matter if the okra's this long or this long. If it snaps clean, then those fibers haven't yet formed. If it makes any kind of splintering, even if you just hear that splintering or you see splinters when you snap it, then the okra is not good to go, again, whether it's long or short. And so the length is less important than the time. We find that the fibers are produced after a certain length of time. And depending on variety, that's anywhere from 3 or 4 days all the way through to 8 or 9 days. The length of the pod is determined by heat and moisture availability. So you could have one plant that produces tender pods that are 6 inches long when it's wet and hot, and then the next week you could have a drought and cool nights, and the same plant might produce fibrous pods that are only 2 inches long. So the length isn't really the question. The question is what conditions are the okra growing in, and you're gonna get the biggest, most tenderest pods under hot, wet conditions. And that's one argument for irrigating okra. Okra is very drought tolerant, but it's not very drought productive. So you can grow okra without irrigation through complete summer drought conditions, but your pods are gonna be small and more fibrous. You're not gonna get good pod quality without that additional water. So that's definitely something to bear in mind. Okay. I'm going to quickly talk about seed saving, not too much because we gave a whole class on it yesterday, but I think it's important to know, and it's so easy to do with okra, and then we're going to move into some food stuff to finish. I'll go back to my pod. Okay. So okra has these big, beautiful flowers. It's fairly classic hibiscus-style flower. They are perfect flowers, so they have both male and female parts, and they can self-pollinate quite happily. So they have all the anatomy to do everything they need to do on their own, but okra's kind of hedging its bet. Because they're big and beautiful, the insects love to come and bathe in that pollen and then fly over to another okra variety and cross that pollen around, and then we have cross-pollination, and we don't managed to save our Clemson spineless to continue being Clemson spineless. So that means we need to do some additional thing to stop that cross-pollination happening. We can separate those two varieties, my red burgundy and my Clemson spineless, by at least 1/4 mile, depending on your area. It could be as much as 1/2 mile, and also how committed you are to purity of seeds. But certainly a fairly big separation distance, more than you'd have in your normal home garden. And so if you're in a home garden situation, then you're gonna want to bag your flowers, and it is so ridiculously easy that I don't think there should be an impediment to you saving okra seed. I'm gonna switch pods. Let's pretend this is a flower or an okra bud. So we're seeing a flower here that has already started to open, which means an insect could have already got in there and shared pollen around. We're looking for a bud stage, which is actually there. So before the flower opens, let's pretend this is a bud, we pop a bag over it, we close that bag up, and now we have an okra bud with a bag over it, and the flower opens inside the bag, which means no insects get into it. It's got both male and female parts, so it can self-pollinate inside the bag. Okra flowers only last for 1 day, so it opens inside the bag, self-pollinates and dies, and then we can come along and take the bag off, and the okra pod that forms, we know without a doubt will only have the genetics of my Clemson spineless. And so when I save seeds and plant them next year, I will be able to grow Clemson spineless with every degree of confidence. The only thing you need to remember after that point, I think I may have a picture, is to label that pod, because your okra plant is going to continue to flower and produce, and you'll be able to continue eating off that plant, but you'll have 1 or maybe 2 pods on that plant that you know are pure seed, and so you're going to want to tie a little label around it to make sure you know that's your seed-saving pod, so that no one goes out and accidentally eats it. And that's the one that you'll let go to this big, long brown stage where you get those nice rattly seeds for seed saving. So really easy. It probably takes about 5 minutes total in terms of activity to save pure seed from your okra if you're growing multiple varieties. And that's how I'm able to save seeds from 60 different varieties that are growing all within 1/8 of a mile of each other. Okay, so that's kind of some of the common things about okra. As long as it's hot and pretty good moisture, you're going to have success once you get past that germination phase. But I'm always available to ask kind of troubleshooting questions through the Utopian Seed Project or Instagram that I'll have linked at the end. So I just want to use our last bit of time together to shift into some of this more expansive stuff with okra that's kind of like formed a lot of the research and the stuff I talk about in the book. I feel like this quote really sums up a lot of how I feel about okra. The plant that seems to hold the wealth of Midas within its branches, so like really every part of it has like golden opportunities. And this was appreciated and written about a lot in the 1800s, early 1900s. And for some reason, okra, it kind of fell out of favor. I spoke to Dr. David Shields, who's a culinary historian, just a few days ago and asked him this very question. And he thinks it's because vegetables went through an age of boiling, and okra is one vegetable that you really don't want to boil. Some people love boiled okra, so if you're a boiled okra lover, then I support you. But it really brings out a lot of those mucilaginous qualities that okra has, and is distasteful to many people. So he thinks that the age of boiling is one of the reasons why okra fell out of favor, but now we're in an age of grilling and roasting and other interesting things with okra, and okra really lends itself to that, and a lot of the flavors come out with that. So we're kind of like maybe in a new appreciative culinary era for okra. But it's not, back in the 1800s, okra was a great thing to eat. So okra produces in abundance. That's one of the things we should love about it, not complain about it. But people do get overwhelmed with that abundance. So this is one of my go-to tricks for like preserving that abundance. You can take about 2 pounds of okra, slice it up and dehydrate it. You can do solar dehydrators. This is an electric one. In the oldie times, they used to put it on metal roofing and leave it in the sun. And about 2 pounds of okra goes down to about 4 ounces of okra. And so almost all of that loss is moisture loss. And you're just concentrating all the flavors into these dehydrated okra rings. And so every winter I have large jars of these dehydrated okra rings on the shelf, and I will funnel them into mainly soups and stews and that type of thing. And as they rehydrate, they take on the okra texture, but they're reabsorbing whatever you're cooking it in, which is usually a stock or tomatoes or whatever. And so the flavor profile of cooking a soup or a gumbo with dehydrated okra like just blows your mind compared with fresh okra, because fresh okra is like 85% water. And so you're getting rid of all that water just to have those concentrated flavors. You can eat these just as a snack. They really become quite moorish, and you just kind of chew on them and they rehydrate in your mouth, and they're absolutely delicious. You can take it to the next level and oil and spice your pods before dehydrating them and actually intend them to be a snack. And once they get to this stage, you can just put them all in a jar and they become a preserved snack to eat whenever you want, and also compacts all that harvest. And then it's a once it's dehydrated, it's a non-energy intensive way to store your okra. That's the picture that probably should have been a little way back about the snap test. You can see a clean snap for a tender pod and a splintered snap for a non-tender pod. So that's like the most reliable way to tell. When you cut into an okra in the kitchen, you can also tell pretty quickly. You can hear the splintering as your knife goes through it. I've become way less concerned about when I'm harvesting, whether an okra is too fibrous or too not, because I've kind of like done away with that boundary in terms of whether it's edible or not. And I now think about like, how will I use it? So when I just harvest all the pods that are out there, whether they're small and tender or big and probably fibrous, and I bring them all into the kitchen and I grade them into 2 piles of fibrous and non-fibrous. The non-fibrous ones fresh eating, roasting, gumbo, whatever you want to do with them. But all the long fibrous ones, as long as they're still green, but just picking up some of those fibers so you wouldn't want to chew on it, I slice and dehydrate them, and then I powder it into a flour. And that okra pod flour is the most, it smells delicious, it tastes delicious. Again, it's all those concentrated flavors. It's high in proteins. It's nutritious, and you can use it as a thickening agent in pretty much anything. And because it's still got that mucilaginous properties, you can use it to bind fruit patties, vegetable patties, you know, whatever you want to do. It has this real, I put it in my masa when I'm making tortillas, and it's like foolproof tortillas, because tortillas will often crumble if you don't get it perfect. Put a little bit of okra flour in, and it just kind of like glues everything together, and I can play frisbee with my daughters with a uncooked tortilla, and it's awesome. So a lot to be said for that okra pod flour, so don't worry about composting them or throwing them away. You can still use them as an edible food. And the other option, which I don't do as much, but this is Chef Clark Barlow that used to be in North Carolina. He shells them like a shelling bean, and then makes this kind of Israeli couscous, which he served in his restaurant and is actually really delicious. He has feta cheese and lemon balm and stuff in it. He gave me that recipe for the book, actually, and it's just a lot of effort to shell enough okra seeds to get to that point, and sometimes they can have a bit of astringency. So it's not my favorite way to do them. If I'm going to shell them all and get those seeds, what I generally do is put them in a jar and cover them with a pickling spice and make little pickled okra seeds that work really well on a salad and can really surprise people. But the seeds are, at that stage, soft and tasty and still really usable, so you don't have to throw it in the compost. I wanted to show you this one. It's kind of showing you what I was talking about with taking the pods and dehydrating and turning them into a flour, but I think I have a picture, or I don't. Once you've got to this flour stage, then there's various things you can do with it to make it more like into a condiment or something like that. So there's a chef from Ghana that was up in New York. She's just gone back to London, Zoe, I forget her surname, Iodan, I think. She sells an okra salt, where she's taking this stage of the okra pods, mixing it with sea salt, and just, it's kind of like an umami type salt that you could add to anything. A version of that is like a callaloo from the Isle of Carriacou, where they take this and then mix it with parched bene, which is sesame seeds, and parched peanuts, and they mix it all together, and it makes this just incredibly flavorful seasoning that you can sprinkle on rice or mix with water and stew fish in, and it's just a very, very versatile food that, again, you could do from fibrous pods. So removing this concern that the pods are fibrous or not fibrous, just shift the way you think about using those pods. This is my like secret mission. What you're seeing here is an okra marshmallow, and I've got this plan to, and I haven't done it yet, but I keep talking about it. I'm going to have a bag of okra marshmallows in my pocket at all times, and the next person to tell me that they hate okra, I'm going to force them to eat one of these, and then after they've eaten it, they've got to take it back because these are delicious. They're basically blended okra pods with honey and vanilla that are then laid out on sheets for dehydrating, and it's kind of like making fruit leather. They melt all down. They go tacky and a little bit sticky, a little bit chewy. They've got some of that green okra flavor, but then the honey and the vanilla really works well with it. And you kind of roll them up and slice them, and then they're rolled in cashew flour, and they're absolutely incredible, and nobody can not enjoy them. So that's my secret plan. Maybe somebody else can do my secret plan for me because I'm disorganized. And then another okra, surprise okra preparation is this okra kimchi. It's really one of the recipes in my book. A chef from Asheville, Chef Steve Goff, gave me this. That still makes my mouth water because it kind of has the spiciness of the chi paste, the sourness of the ferment, and then the crunchy greenness of the okra. And he takes the whole pods and rolls them in coarse salt, and it just punctures the outside of the skin and allows it to sweat and start fermenting without actually releasing all the slime. If you were to slice okra to ferment it, it would be like a stringy, gooey mess, which some people would like, but a lot of people wouldn't. And this kind of deals with that issue. Okay, I'm gonna rattle through some of these other ones. Okra flowers are totally edible, and I want you to try eating them this year if you're growing okra. In terms of uses, I've dried them and put them in a vinegar to make a vinegar extract that goes beautiful red. When I realized I could make red vinegar, I wanted to make red vodka, which is the next one you see. So there's a beautiful red color from a vodka extract. And as soon as you've made okra flower vodka, you're obligated to make an okra flower vodka Bloody Mary, which you garnish with pickled okra. And then this is the special thing. This straw here is a dehydrated okra petiole, and the petiole is the part of the plant that joins the stem to the leaf. And it happens that they're hollow, and when you dehydrate them, then they go dry like a straw and maintain their hollowness, and you can use them to drink. My daughters use them to drink milk. They know where I keep my secret stash. And the really this is another one of my business models that someone can run with if they want to. These are shareable straws because okra mucilage has antibacterial properties. So you can, when you start drinking it, it rehydrates slightly and goes a little bit slimy on the end. And that slime is antibacterial. So technically you could share the straw with all your friends and be totally safe. So no one's jumped on that one yet. I'm not sure why. The okra leaves have a higher protein count than the pods. Are totally edible, and when they're young, they're quite tender. They're pretty tasty. We already eat some of their relatives. There's a beaker in the Pacific Island nations is widely used, which is a close relative to okra. And just nobody's really exploring or using okra leaves yet. We had a few chefs work with them. A local microgreen company was selling okra microgreens for the leaves. They're kind of like sunflower microgreens because they got some of that chunky bite to them, so it adds a good lift to the microgreen mix. And then if you use a red variety, you've got this beautiful red stem. So a really good microgreen opportunity. We had chef Ian Bowden up in Virginia just likes to fry them and has won some awards for frying just the leaves. That was a garnish to a bigger dish, but he included fried okra leaves in that award-winning dish. And then a local Indian restaurant, Chai Pani in Asheville, has taken the leaves and included them into, it used to be a kale leaf pakora, but he put it into an okra leaf pakora. So some creative ways to use the leaves as a high nutritious summer green. Also got that mucilaginous property, so if you were to put them into a soup, it would have the thickening effect that we expect from okra. And then to finish, the seed is also highly useful, so that dried seed at the end has a lot of really good properties. So what we're seeing on the left is that dried seed roasted and ground to give a real coffee aroma-esque flour that can be used in a whole range of baking uses. And then we're seeing on the right is the whole pod dried and ground, which we already spoke about. And in the middle, we're seeing the seed that is being run through a mill to take off the outside hull, which is quite tough, and just bring out that internal kernel. And so what we're talking about here is if you go out and buy hemp seeds, you're buying hemp hearts, which is really good marketing. And I think one day we should have okra hearts, which would just be the kernel of the okra seed. And that's what you're seeing in the middle. And this is just some local bakers made an okra seed sourdough, an okra seed muffin, really rich, nutty flavors that are delicious and nutritious. Studies coming out of some parts of Africa are showing that okra seed can fortify foods, like wheat-based foods can be fortified with okra seed to increase the nutritional profile. And then this was just my personal experiment where I took an acorn flour recipe and switched in roasted okra seeds and made a roasted okra seed pancake. Again, all that kind of like coffee flavors and nuttiness comes through in those pancakes, and they're really, really good. This one was a bit of a fail, so I'm going to skip over that. That was an okra seed tempeh that local tempeh company used using the hemp theory, but until we get okra hearts, we're not going to be able to make okra tempeh because the hull is too thick for the tempeh to penetrate. And then okra seed oil. This is a personal mission. This year, Clay Oliver Farms has sponsored a breeding project that the Utopian Seed Project is doing to really try and develop a better okra seed oil. But currently it's low yielding, but entirely delicious. And he's the only one selling it. So okra seed oil is a real nice finishing oil, salad oil. And so what all this means, all these different uses, all this exciting development that could happen with okra and has happened in the past to some extent, leaves us with this quote from The Lost Crops of Africa, which is where I'll leave the presentation. In reality, okra could have a future that will make people puzzle over why earlier generations failed to seize the opportunity before their eyes. In the botanical kingdom, it may actually be a Cinderella, though still living on the hearth of neglect amid the ashes of scorn. That's the Utopian Seed Project. That's me, and that's my book. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. Last summer, after I read your book, I did try okra flowers, and any visitors we had, they had to try okra flowers as well. And everybody liked them, and I love them, and I'm looking forward to this summer. It can't come fast enough. We're gonna take a 5-minute break. We'll be back. We're gonna just change up speakers. Brie will be here, so we'll see you in 5 minutes.
everybody, I'm Brie Arthur, and I am excited for day 2 of the Soil³ live stream backyard vegetable growing in the spring session. Thank you all for joining us. This has been a really fun time. I hope that you all learned so much from Chris. I am so obsessed with okra, thanks to him, that it may actually be that I start using it as a grain in this season. And today I'm going to talk to you about foodscaping with grains. This is definitely a passion project of mine. I know that it's not ordinary for home gardeners to have wheat or barley in their front yard, but I'm going to try and change your mind about that, because I think that these traditional agricultural crops actually deserve some love and attention by home gardeners, because they have a lot of really useful properties, and that's what we're going to dive into today. So for those of you who haven't met me, my name is Brie, and I also go by the hashtag Crazy Grain Lady. It turns out there's no one else on the planet that wants to be identified in that way. So if you want to see anything from my journey as a grain grower, you can just Google Crazy Grain Lady, and you can see all the pictures that I have posted to the internet over the past 7 or 8 years. Now, I am very much inspired by agriculture. I grew up in southeastern Michigan. I went to college in northwest Indiana. And for most of my life, I have absolutely taken for granted the resources that farmers provide our society. And it's only really been in the last decade where I started thinking more critically about the choices that I make, from the purchases that I have at grocery stores, and having a better understanding of what really goes into making it possible that we have access to food 24 hours a day, 365 days of the year, and having a better appreciation for how fragile our food system can be, and trying to come up with horticultural solutions to help regionalize food production in a really meaningful and unique way. So when I visit the Midwest and I see fields of grain, I am just filled with hope and inspired for what I can do as a landscape designer and home gardener to take a piece of that and actually apply it to my landscape to try to get other people to at least have a recognition of what these essential crops are. And for me, it's all about transitioning agriculture and applying it to these residential situations that we find ourselves living in. I live in the suburbs of Raleigh. I don't have a tractor. I don't live on a farm. But how can I take that ethic and apply it to the little bit of land that I am stewarding, so that I can be a more conscientious consumer and a better land manager? So I ultimately dream that landscapes should be both beautiful and bountiful. And over my 20-year career, I have been a bit frustrated by the delineation of, ornamentals go here and edibles go there, and they're never allowed to mingle, and, we use our resources in really sort of strange, divided ways. And for me, I think that we have so much more potential to reach. And particularly with regard to training the next generation to be better land managers and to really value the resources of our planet and not take things for granted. We have to simply address the fact that we need clean drinking water and that we live in an ecosystem. We don't dominate it, we're a part of it, and we can make a meaningful contribution. And I hope that the act of teaching this next generation how to garden and where food comes from will lead them to a better ethic for land stewardship. And I really believe that our landscapes and gardens should be a resource to teach people where food comes from. We have had many generations now that are very much separated from the agriculture community. And you ask somebody, where did that apple come from? And, they say Publix. No, apples didn't start, actually. They started at a farm. There was a person that was growing that. But when you give someone the opportunity to grow food, they develop a greater appreciation for the process in which that food is made available to us. And so for me, it's really about teaching people to value both ornamental and edible horticulture, kind of blur the lines between the two. And that led me to the concept of foodscaping, which is really kind of mixing a bunch of, wonderful approaches to growing, including permaculture methods and, understanding the value of ornamental plants and bringing them all together to really get the most out of the space that you're growing in. And the idea of this is really simple. It's just integrating edibles and ornamentals together. Whether you do it in the ground, in your landscape, or in your container plantings, it doesn't really matter. It's really getting you to think kind of outside of this idea that you can only grow, food crops in this one tiny little corner of your backyard. And instead thinking more critically about how you can use all of the land that you have access to. And everything that I get to talk to people about was inspired by Rosalind Creasy. For me, I read Roz's book, Edible Landscaping, and it completely transformed my goals as a landscape designer. And if you're not familiar with Roz, please Google her, buy all of her books. She's written 23 books on the subject of edible landscaping. She's absolutely brilliant. And the books are so beautiful and inspiring. You won't be able to control yourself, frankly, once you get into this idea. Oh, there we go. And really behind all of this is the concept of diversity. And so, it's up to you as the gardener to make the very best decisions about the plants that you're gonna grow. But don't get too stuck in any one of these categories. I want you to grow ornamental plants that bring you joy. And I want you to have native plants that provide ecosystem services. And I want you to grow the food crops that you love to eat. There's no reason that you have to only pick one category. You get to pick the best plants from all of these to make your gardening experience as good as possible. And it's really important to recognize that food crops lack diversity. So in the example that we talked about a lot yesterday, Brassicaceae plants, it's pretty amazing that one genus species could be delineated into so many different types of plants. But at the end of the day, when you isolate all of these things in one area, you've created a monoculture. And a monoculture doesn't matter if it's 4,000 acres or 48 square feet in a raised bed. What you need to focus on is greater diversity in your plant selections. And that can be really challenging when you're growing food crops because fundamentally, they're not representing a lot of different plant families. So when you go and evaluate everything that you have in your landscape, I want you to first look at cultivar, species, genera, then take one step back and start tallying how many different plant families that you have. And then when you go to the garden center to buy new things, I want you to focus on expanding the diversity of the plant families that you grow with. Ultimately, this is what's going to lead to plants flowering at different times of year, bringing in more beneficial insects, and ultimately reducing a lot of the problem bug and disease problems that you experience. Everything comes down to diversity. But today, we're going to be actually focusing on the Poaceae family, my all-time favorite plant family. I literally can't imagine life without it. I actually originally got into horticulture as a turf grass major. I love mowing in straight lines, like irrationally love. It just brings me so much peace and joy. And so I have long been fascinated by grass, and it was a real aha moment for me when I first started growing grains to think, hey, this is basically the same as the turf that we walk on. This is not really any different than the ornamental grasses that we're all accustomed to having in our landscapes that provide us with such great low maintenance, beautiful dynamic displays. So why aren't grains a part of our normal everyday growing? Because we're already growing their cousins, So to me, it just seemed super logical that I start incorporating grains in because it's something I'd never grown before. And I'm curious. I like to grow weird things. I can't help myself. So Chris mentioned this yesterday, and it was, it's something that maybe we don't always think about, the mechanisms in which plants are pollinated. Because it's really easy to assume that every plant has to have an insect. But one of the greatest advantages of grains, and really one of the reasons that they have such high yields, and that they are like a global staple food product, is the fact that they're wind pollinated and that we're not depending on bugs to do all the work. We're actually allowing just a normal breeze to provide the plants the pollination that they require. And I think that's a really important distinction in understanding, how grain crops have evolved to be so important in global agriculture. Now, there's a big difference, and people get grains mixed up. So we have a lot of language issues nowadays. Like, unfortunately, the word green doesn't really mean anything, and the term organic is relatively confused. And I mean, unfortunately, grains have fallen into this category because we don't think critically about, what is the actual definition. So I'm gonna define it for you. Grains are grass plants whose seed can be ground into flour. It doesn't require it being ground into flour, but that's one of the distinguishing characteristics. So they come from the Poaceae family. Now, pseudocereals, also sometimes called grains, are not in the grass family. They are not Poaceae. In fact, many are in the Amaranthaceae family, similar like to Swiss chard. These are relatives that have different components of edibility, including the fact that you can eat their seed. But they are fundamentally distinguished. So there's also another term that's been popping up that causes a great deal of confusion and allows people to charge more for a product that isn't maybe actually better, which is very frustrating to me, and that is the term ancient grains. So they're all ancient. They're all more than 3,000 years old. In fact, most of the archaeology will prove that they exceed 10,000 years in cultivation. So don't fall into this label that you have to pay, $3 more for a bag of flour because it's from an ancient grain, because it's not necessarily accurate. That's a marketing term. Now, there are some grains that are important to recognize that they have speciated differently, so they are distinctly different. And that includes in the wheat category, like spelt, kamut, einkorn, emmer. These are going to be varieties that are more true to form, meaning they have lower chromosome count. Don't worry, we're going to talk more about chromosomes later. So they're going to be slightly easier for people to digest. That doesn't mean that they don't have gluten. So if you have celiacs, you're still not going to want to be eating any of those. But for people who have gluten sensitivities, these are varieties that you're going to be able to potentially introduce to your diet in low amounts. I'm a person who suffers from this, so I fully understand. And you'll still be able to enjoy, some of the delicious breads and things. Now, there are other cereals that get categorized as ancient, and that includes barley, millet, teff, oats, sorghum. Again, these are just old plants. That's what ancient means, right? Come from a different era of civilization. And then, of course, there are pseudo-cereals, things like amaranth and buckwheat and chia. You don't really have to fall into the category of buying only ancient grains, and I will tell you in a little while some of the disadvantages of growing ancient grains, because I did fall into this. I told you yesterday, I'm really good at doing things wrong. My main goal as a communicator is to share my failures so you don't have to make the same mistakes. And I was 100% hook, line, and sinker into ancient grains until nature proved me wrong. Now, the number one question that I get, frankly, about absolutely everything is it deer-proof? Okay, just stop asking that question, okay? Nothing's deer-proof, you guys. Just stop. I actually devoted an entire chapter to this subject in Gardening with Grains because if you don't talk about it, no one really listens to anything else that you have to say. The reality is, no. Animals love grains just as much as people do. Now, there are strategies that you can employ to help prevent deer from eating everything, but I'm telling y'all, that's a 2-hour webinar on its own, so I cannot cover all that information today. If you're curious about it, you can sign up for one of my deer-proof webinars, or you can just read Chapter 9 in Gardening with Grains. They do attract wildlife and a whole bunch of different kinds of animals. So cats absolutely love nibbling on the fresh greens of grains. If you've ever seen a bag of seeds called cat grouse, It's just oat seed, y'all. They just want to nibble on some oat greens. They're no different than people who want a green smoothie. So if you have cats and you want to feed them something nutritious, just grow some grains. You can do it in a pot, you can grow it in the ground. I actually have really gotten into growing grains with one specific objective, to provide my own bird seed. I was fascinated when I was researching for this book how many pesticides are applied to the bird seed that you buy in commercial stores, with one exception, Birds Unlimited. So there you have it. But the reason that pesticides are applied is really simple. It's to keep the maggots from eating the seed while it's in storage. But if you want to prevent potentially poisoning your birds with pesticides, you can grow your own bird seed really, really easily. And in the process, you're going to get to learn about growing something new that is super beautiful, and it'll be a very authentic experience for you and your family. All right, where should you grow grains? Well, I'm willing to bet that you've never seen a field of wheat in the middle of a forest, right? So it should be obvious they need to grow in more sun than shade. Really, full sun is ideal. I classify full sun as 8+ hours for grains. They really do want like sun up to sundown. And one of my main inspirations for growing grains came from an amazing garden, Chanticleer, which is outside of Philadelphia. If you ever have the opportunity, this is a life-changing garden. I truly think it's one of the best gardens in America. And they have this incredible border called the Serpentine. And each season they do crop rotations. So they're trying to show people this agricultural impact with growing grains and legumes, but you can do it in the juxtaposition of a mown lawn. So you have this installation that feels very farmy, but that could fit into a residential landscape. Well, this was 100% the motivation that I had for then taking up a middle section of my front lawn and putting in a grain bed in the middle of my front yard. And when I was there first seeing this, they were growing barley, which totally blew my mind. I mean, this again goes to speak for the idea that I've been drinking beer for like 20 years, and I had never once really thought critically about the ingredients that were in the beer that I was consuming. Once I saw barley growing, my whole life and my perspective on every bottle of beer has completely changed. I spent like over an hour on my hands and knees crawling around in this barley. I shouldn't admit that, but I might as well just be honest, because I'm, not totally well adjusted. When the barley display started to bloom, this was 100% the most popular thing that people were asking about at Chanticleer. Like, it was just, they were overwhelmed by the response of people seeing this because so many of us, particularly on the East Coast, have never actually seen barley being grown. This is traditionally something that's grown in the West. So I was determined to figure out, how much beer do you get, right? That's the burning question that we all have. Like, if you're gonna do this, like, you might as well grow it for the purpose of consumption. So they had a very large stand. They had like 2,500 square feet. My barley bed is only 850 square feet. And the first year, I actually only got enough seed to do 200 square feet. So I grew this out, and I saved all of the seed from that installation, and then I grew it the next year, and I covered 800 square feet. And so we malted it and brewed it, and we ended up getting 128 pints of beer from my front yard barley stand, which was the coolest thing ever. Like, of all the experiments I've ever done, I have to say I think this is the one that has the most lasting impact. Now, I didn't harvest all of that seed myself. I actually had the dedicated kids from the Junior Master Gardeners of Cumberland County come out and have an authentic grain harvesting experience. But this really got me to start thinking about, well, what does the word local actually mean? Because, yeah, we all have microbreweries everywhere, but it turns out like the only local ingredient in beer that's brewed in my community is the water. Well, that hardly counts, like, where did the hops come come from? Where is the barley? Where are the other ingredients actually being grown? For me, it's not about where it's made. It's about, what's the carbon footprint of getting those ingredients to you? And so I really started to get mad when I would go to restaurants that were like local, right? And they charged twice as much. And the only ingredients that were actually local were the lettuce. It's like the least important part of the meal as far as I'm concerned. Here they're serving rice and they're serving bread, but none of that was actually derived from local farmers. So it really got my mind churning about, how can we do a better job of making the word local not just become a marketing term? How can we make it meaningful, right? Well, that has led me down this rabbit hole of being a grain grower. And ultimately, I think it's made me a much better gardener, a much more conscientious consumer, a better cook. I'm far more aware of like random ingredients that are in pre-processed foods and all of the things that I have become allergic to that are a result of a gluten sensitivity. And I think it's just been a really valuable experience that more people like me could benefit from. So it's made me hyper aware of gluten-free grains as I become less and less capable of eating a sack of bread. And I've been really, excited about being able to grow my own that, I know 100% hasn't been treated with pesticides and it hasn't had, fungicides added. And, I know where it's coming from and it's 0 mile or 0 kilometer. So when should you plant grains? Well, you have 2 categories, particularly for growers in the Southeast. So you have cool season grains, which are going to be varieties that are frost tolerant. And those are really best planted September through December. And then you can also do them February and March, depending on which part of the Southeast you're in. I usually sow my grains on Black Friday. That is like my weekend where I get done with Thanksgiving and then I am in the garden the rest of the time and no one bothers me. I highly recommend making that one of your Thanksgiving traditions. And then the warm season grains are varieties that need to be grown after the threat of frost. So these are plants that like hot soil, they like heat and humidity. So these are plants that typically would be, sown maybe starting in May, but really ideally in June. And then they're gonna be harvested before temperatures start getting cold and we have consistent frosts. So how should you grow them? Well, I have 3 suggestions for you. The first way, if you've never grown grains before and this idea sounds completely insane, I just want you to start with some containers, okay? We're gonna ease you into the process. So grains in containers, it literally couldn't be simpler. You fill a pot with Soil³, you scatter the seeds on top, you mulch it lightly, it'll germinate within 2 weeks, and then it will grow out all season long, and it looks just like an ornamental grass, period. Nothing weird about this at all. Now, I frequently get asked, well, how much wheat do you get, right? If you're growing wheat in a pot, what do you actually get from it? Well, you're not gonna get a lot. It's just a couple of containers. So last year we set out to find the answer to this. So we did 5 3-gallon fabric bags full of wheat, and we got enough flour to make 1 loaf of bread. There you have it. It's not gonna change your grocery store habits, but it gives you a very authentic experience making that single loaf of bread. And if you do it with a child, they then will appreciate when they go to the grocery store and they see all that bread available, they have a better understanding of what's actually in that. Now, if you've graduated from pots, you want to put them into your landscape, but you're afraid that you're gonna look crazy or make your neighbors mad, then you want to grow them in clumps. So they're gonna look just like an ornamental grass. Everything that you already have, miscanthus and sea oats and pennisetums and all the normal stuff that everybody is already used to seeing. They're not really gonna be able to tell you the difference between the ornamental plant and the one that has seeds that you can actually eat. So the process is really simple. You're gonna rake an open area. I usually do it about 3 foot wide all the way around and just a few inches deep. and you're gonna scatter your seed on top of that. You're gonna cover it back up. You can lightly mulch it, and it's gonna germinate in place, and it's gonna just grow out like an ornamental grass, just as a clump. You can do this with warm season grains, you can do this with cool season grains. And it applies really well in a landscape where it's neat and tidy and reads as organized. And I understand, that's really important. I do clumps in my landscape too because I like for there to be some element that things look like I've done it on purpose. But my really favorite way to do this, and what I really hope everybody will get into, is this idea of a mixed meadow. And it's just the most magical experience when you come across a border of grains and flowers growing together. It's truly something that is like otherworldly. So the process for this is pretty easy. You're gonna have a sunny, open space. You're gonna top dress with Soil³. I usually say 2 to 6 inches depending on your soil quality. The real key here is that your seeds are gonna germinate in the Soil³ so you know that they're gonna be successful. And then they're gonna just, they're gonna grow out together. So you're gonna seed the grain and you're gonna choose whatever flowers you want. In the case of like when we grow wheat and barley, so we're sowing this on Black Friday. We always include poppies and larkspur in this mix. The reason we do that is really simple. The larkspur and poppies help prevent the deer from eating all of the delicious wheat. Now I said this yesterday, I'm gonna say it again. Poisonous plants like larkspur don't translocate their chemistry, so the wheat is totally safe for you to eat. The critical thing here is that you don't eat the larkspur. Okay, just harvest the wheat seeds if you have the intention of eating it. But the advantage of this is that the mammals leave your bed alone and you're not having to go out and constantly spray, I Must Garden or, whatever repellent you choose. This is a lower maintenance way to create a more dynamic display that is very practical for those of us who have a lot of mammal pressure. And now the key here is to have good ground plane coverage. And the reason for that is to reduce your weed pressure. So if you engage the ground plane with things on purpose, there's less opportunity for weeds to incorporate themselves in. And this is really just trying to make it so that you have less long-term work. And this applies for all aspects of your landscape. If you cover the ground up, you will have fewer weeds. Now we go through and hand harvest all of these seeds. So I'm frequently asked, do these grains become invasive? And in my experience, under no circumstance have they ever become invasive. The cool season grains can't live through the summer. The warm season grains can't live through the winter. So I have had zero problems with anything self-sowing and sort of becoming a pest. But we're intentionally growing this for the purpose of harvesting these to eat. So we just go through and hand harvest the seed heads. We're leaving all that biomass because that's wheat straw. That's the stuff you buy, right? So I can grow my own wheat straw, mow it in place, let it decompose, add organic matter to my soil, and I'm immediately making my growing space more applicable for me to be able to grow any other plant. Now we do go through the full process of threshing and winnowing and grinding so that everybody of every age has the experience of literally seeing it from seed to cookie. And frankly, chocolate chip cookies are a pretty good way to get kids addicted to growing grains, I've realized. Bread was somewhat popular. Chocolate chip cookies were like, that's the gateway. So I think this is a really fun experience. It's one of those things that we always do when we have, junior master gardeners or kids garden clubs coming over, because the threshing and winnowing process is something that most people haven't done. And like Chris was describing yesterday in his seed saving workshop, there's different tools that you use. You can see we're using that box fan, just like Chris said yesterday. We blow all that chaff back into the garden. It's nutrient dense. And all of this is reducing my need to add fertilizer. So how much flour do we get from this major bed? So we average 20 pounds of ground flour annually when I fill this bed up. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I don't cook that much from straight flour. So 20 pounds of flour would last me like a decade. I've actually had to go out of my way to develop a bread baking habit, which isn't necessarily good for your waistline. However, it's delicious, and because this grain hasn't been treated with anything, I haven't had problems eating it. And I think that, for me, has been a real eye-opener, just having a greater understanding of what is happening to the crops that we eat and why are we developing food allergies. So it's really got my mind turning because I want residential landscapes to mean more than they currently do. I think the bar is set extraordinarily low. We literally have nowhere to go but up. But if 100 of my neighbors, we all have the same amount of property, just did 800 square feet of sunny front yard space, my neighborhood alone could supply 2,000 pounds of local organic wheat to a bakery or to a local brewery. That means more than what we're currently doing, which is nothing. We're not supporting anything local with our current front yard standards. So I also grow grains for the purpose of soil improvement. I live in a former tobacco field. I have every disease and every root knot nematode that has ever landed on the face of the earth. So gardening in this place is extremely challenging. But what I've realized is that grains, even though they're annuals, have really deep taproots. In fact, oats are notorious for having roots that go 36 to 54 inches down into the ground in less than 6 months. They're natural rototillers. You don't need a machine to till your soil. You can just sow some seeds and be lazy like me. You know, what's also super cool about grains is that they scavenge nutrients from deep below the soil and draw them back up, providing nutrients for the next cycle of plants. And this is why grains are a normal part of crop rotations in agriculture. So I love to be able to use grains as a cover crop. You know, in the winter season, before I started growing wheat and barley, I didn't really have that many plants that were covering the ground in the winter, and I had huge winter weed infestations. Because most of my plants were active in the summertime. That's totally normal. That's the plant palette that home gardeners use. Once I started employing this tactic, my work level went down significantly, actually to the point that during the pandemic, I was starting to freak out because I didn't have enough to do to keep me occupied while I was stuck at home. Now, I recommend rotating your crops, doing grains and legumes. You can actually do them at the same time. In the case of like oats and peas, that's a complete cover crop. I will often rotate, a grain, a cereal crop in the winter season with a nitrogen fixer like peanuts through the summertime. Peanuts are really beautiful. They're low maintenance. The main issue I have is that rabbits are addicted to them, but still a fantastic, unique plant that most home gardeners have never experienced. But there's actually a whole bunch of different legumes that you can employ for the purpose of nitrogen fixation. So, I love crimson clover. I think that's probably the plant that I'm maybe most obsessed with right now. Also, I think faba beans and soybeans are really great. I'm a little bit weary of vetch just because I have a huge vetch infestation. However, to its credit, it does fix nitrogen. Now let's get into some of the specifics about these different types of grains. So we have the cool season grain category. These are plants that prefer cool soil and cool air. These are plants that are absolutely tolerant of temperatures well below freezing. In fact, many varieties are going to be cold hardy, as in growing vegetatively to -10. So if you live in the southeast, you can grow these all winter without any problem. They're not going to burn in a frost. Actually, they want frost. So they're typically sown in late fall or early spring and then harvested like early summer or midsummer. So barley is the first example, and that is what I call the beauty queen. I think barley is the most beautiful plant that I have ever cultivated, period. I really don't understand why barley just isn't a plant that you would just buy in a container at a garden center. It rivals pink muley grass for its beauty when it's in flower. So again, barley is really critical for beer, but it's also really important for whiskey. So I've been doing webinars with Amy Stewart called Spirits in the Garden, where we talk about all the plants that are used for growing alcohol. And she's been explaining that whiskey is often like 40% barley because it has this really incredible bonding capacity. So for whiskey, or for bourbon to technically be bourbon, it has to be 51% corn, but often the other 49% is from barley, y'all. But barley is a really cool plant because it has this crazy history, like entwined with humanity. So have you ever wondered what your shoe size means? Because your shoe size doesn't equate to anything that we talk about. Like, it's not inches, it's not centimeters, it doesn't really make any sense. It dates back to when barley was a form of measurement, a form of currency, and also the weight standard. So I wear a women's size 7. It's exactly 7 barley seeds put together. That's what your shoe size is referring to. A completely antiquated concept, but it still exists in our society thousands of years later. It's also, you know, the idea of like you can eat your savings. Well, that also dates back to when barley was money. And you could eat your money if you didn't have enough to be able to like trade and you know, buy other food crops. Now, oats, I call oats the dancer. I think oats are the most elegant of all the grains. They have, you know, these like weeping seed heads, a really beautiful broad leaf. It's sort of grayish silver, an absolutely excellent addition to any landscape just for its ornamental appeal. And oats really do have one of the deeper root systems, especially considering it's a 6-month crop. So it's easy to look at perennials and think, of course they have deep root systems. They live forever. You know, like it's entirely possible that a panicum that you plant is gonna like outlive you. So of course it's gonna have a deep root system. But grains are annuals. They only live for part of the year. For that to develop root systems that deeply is really remarkable. So as I mentioned, oats and peas are a complete cover crop, best sown in the fall. And of course, to the term of sowing your wild oats, actually did go back to the idea of sowing a crop that you regret, a crop that wasn't disease resistant or not appropriate for your climate. Now, wheat is the workhorse. Wheat was my gateway to grains. To give a shout out to Chip Hope. He's a fantastic agricultural professor at Appalachian State. And he's the one who handed me my first bag of wheat seeds and challenged me to grow something that I'd never grown. And it completely changed my life. Like, definitely turned me into an even crazier person than I thought I was. But it's such a remarkable plant, and there's great diversity in the wheat varieties that you can grow. So some of the distinctions are related to the parts of the plant. So you have awnless and awned varieties. So if you're growing wheat for the purpose of grinding it into flour for eating, you're probably better off to do an awnless variety because there's less stuff, there's less chaff for you to get rid of. But if you're growing the wheat for the purpose of it looking beautiful, maybe you're gonna use it in dried flour arrangements, the awned varieties are remarkable. And there's really cool ones that have like black awns. And to me, the awns essentially look like cat whiskers. Because remember, I'm not only the crazy grain lady, I'm also a crazy cat lady. So wheat is really incredible. It's an extraordinarily important crop for this planet. You know, we're in America, we're very privileged to have access to so much that we don't always have to think about the practicality of things. But the reality is wheat is a staple crop in this world. And, you know, it does provide 13% of the vegetable protein that people in, you know, societies that maybe have less advantage and less money, so that it actually keeps people living and healthy. So please don't judge wheat unfairly just because you're on the paleo diet. There are other people who don't have the same privileges as all of us, and wheat is a really important example of that. It's also grown on more land than any other crop on the planet. I worry about wheat's longevity as we face the reality of climate, and it isn't necessarily going to fare well if temperatures rise increasingly. But remember, wheat is a cool season plant, so you're not growing this through the heat of the summer. Now, here is where we get a little discussion about genetics. So stem strength actually matters a lot. Now, it really matters for people that are using giant combines to harvest huge fields. But even as a front yard wheat grower, it turned out that my ancient grains, which were very simple chromosome structure, didn't have the stem strength to withstand a simple rainstorm like we're experiencing today. And after like a half an inch of rain, every plant lodged, flopped to the ground, and it was a huge mess. And it was the first time, I am ashamed to admit this, it was literally the first time in my horticulture career where I finally started to recognize the importance of crop science and the advances that we have from better understanding genetics and understanding what that actually means for the practicality of growing a plant. So the GMO discussion is a really difficult one because it's not black and white. There's a whole lot of gray area, and I'd recommend that you educate yourself before you form too firm of an opinion, because there's a lot of work being done for increased nutrient density and better disease and insect resistance. And so, again, when I wrote Gardening with Grains, prior to that, my world was much simpler. It was more black and white. And after this book, I really started to understand more of the complications of navigating this extraordinarily difficult world that we live in. So a little bit about chromosomes, and so that you have some better understanding of what you're eating now versus what people were eating 3,000 years ago, lends itself to the concept that for mass agriculture, we need plants that have a sturdier capacity. And einkorn, which is one of those varieties that falls into the ancient grain category, it's a diploid, it only has 14 chromosomes. Whereas modern varieties are usually exceeding 42 chromosomes. So there's a discussion about gluten sensitivity in relation to our body's ability to digest the gluten from varieties that have increased chromosome count. Now, it's new science. We don't have all of the answers, but this may be a contributing factor. What I think is actually probably more of an issue, and it's not so much related to the wheat that we eat directly or the grains that we eat directly, it's more about the cultural practices for the grains that animals eat. So very frequently, to be efficient, and again, this is where gray area comes in, farmers spray grain fields with persistent herbicides so that the grains dry out evenly, so that they can harvest efficiently. They can go in one time with that combine. And that totally makes sense because we have the lowest price of food crops ever, and we're feeding more people than ever before. So there are gonna be some contingencies that happen as a result of this demand. But the problem is these persistent herbicides, which, by the way, it is not Roundup, okay? This would actually not be a problem if they were spraying glyphosate. Glyphosate doesn't operate this way. It only operates on green material. But these persistent herbicides stay active even after the animals eat them, and then we eat the animal's meat. It has herbicides in it. We use the animal's compost, and what we bring into our properties is killer compost. And this was really one of the things that I have bought so much bad soil over the years that when I found Soil³ and I found their information that they were guaranteeing there were no persistent herbicides in their product, it was a game changer for me. And it's really the reason that, like, Joe Lample bought a bunch of killer compost, and you can find this information on the Growing a Greener World website. This is a profound problem that is increasing, not decreasing, in its availability to people. Most people, by the way, they always blame their neighbor's lawn care service. It's so funny how it happens. And it's like, actually, it's the compost that you're growing in. So this is really why I rely on Soil³, because I'm tired of spending money on products that let me down, that make me fail. And I'm so grateful that Soil³ has done the work to make this something that I don't have to think about anymore. So let's get into warm season grains, because these are the things that you're gonna start growing right now. So corn, we talked about corn yesterday. Chris was talking about it, and I think that corn is the catalyst for change. It's certainly the most controversial of all grain crops, simply because of the genetic modification discussion revolving around it. Also really important in corn to recognize that it's not just being grown for us to eat or as animal feed. There's actually like 3,500 different uses for corn. And frankly, if you've gotten a tank of gas in the last 20 years, you've put corn in your car. So a lot of the genetic modifications on corn that people are concerned about aren't necessarily related to corn for consumption. It's corn for biofuels. So again, talking about all these gray areas with genetics, it's a far more difficult discussion than just to say it's good or bad. Now, I actually think that corn is really important because it's our only native grain. It's native to North America. There's basically nothing that our current corn has in common with the old-fashioned native corn, but at least you can say it is from this continent. Now, I probably grow corn in the least controversial way. I use it as an exclamation point. I just think it's a really dynamic plant because it has cool texture, and there's really interesting varieties that you can grow that have variegated foliage, and, super colorful ears, and I just think that corn is a plant that every home gardener should grow, if for no other reason, just because it's pretty. Now, rice. Rice is the mystifier, and this is totally because people look at me like I'm from Mars when I say that I grow my own rice, but I'm gonna show you how today. So I learned about rice from my friend Dewey and his mother, who have immigrated to the US from Laos. And they grow a ton of rice in their suburban neighborhood with an HOA. It is the funniest thing that how they have transformed their neighborhood as a result of growing, these kind of subtropical plants. And when I went over to Dewey's house and he gave me rice seed, it was much like that experience with Chip, where my life will never be the same as a result of this exposure. And that's why I want to share this with you guys. I want you to have that same joy. So just think of rice as a warm season grass, okay? It's no different than purple fountain grass, except that it has better structural integrity. So it's extremely ornamental, and it does extremely well in the heat and humidity. So it's really well suited for the Southeast. In fact, rice is the crop that made Charleston the richest city in the world. So if you aren't aware of that, you should totally go down and visit Charleston and do some of the tours so you can learn more. So the reason that I got addicted to rice was actually realizing that there are purple-leafed varieties, so they're super ornamental, but they don't collapse every time we get a 1/4 inch of rain, which is what purple fountain grass does. I mean, how dumb is that the grass is falling to the ground when we barely even have a rain shower, when you can grow something that looks the same that actually stands upright? So 2 of my favorite varieties are Carolina Gold and Black Madres. And the Black Madres is actually one of the plants that I'm 1,000% addicted to. I grow it in pots in my driveway. So, it doesn't have to be grown in constant moisture. However, it does benefit from having a lot of access to water. But the reason that rice is grown in paddies is actually to be a natural form of herbicide. So rice is not genetically modified. It does not get oversprayed with glyphosate or any other herbicide. They flood those fields because the rice is tolerant of the water and the competing weeds aren't. So it's really quite brilliant. So there's actually 40,000 varieties of rice, but unfortunately in America, you're gonna be lucky if you get 10 different cultivars. I don't know why that is. I'm aiming to try and normalize rice, so maybe we'll have more availability in the future. And it's a fantastic container plant. So it absolutely loves, you can grow it with things like begonias and coleus and sweet potato vines. No one's afraid of any of those plants. If you have a persnickety HOA, you could totally sneak rice in. No one is gonna know that you've done it. Actually, that's what I did at some golf courses a few years ago. They all thought it was super pretty. When I told them what it was, all of a sudden they let me plant, potatoes and peppers in different ornamental beds. So I want to give you guys the rice growing challenge because this is my goal for 2021, to not be the only person growing rice in their driveway. So I'm gonna show you how easy it is right now. All you need is a plastic pot with no holes. Like, you can't basically grow anything else in pots with no holes. So take advantage of those containers, grow some rice. And I recommend waiting until June to do this. And the process is really easy. So you're gonna fill your pot up with Soil³, as I have here. And then you need to make sure that you buy rice from a seed supplier, because the rice you buy at the grocery store doesn't germinate. I've tried. And you're just gonna scatter that rice seed over top. I like to do mine pretty densely. And then the final step, super easy. You're gonna take another handful of soil and you're gonna cover it up, and it's gonna germinate in place. And you will have a pot of rice to grow all summer long. It's literally that easy. Like, it could not be simpler. Everything else in this world is harder than growing rice, okay? But I did some experiments last year so that I could give you better advice. And the rice that I sowed in April didn't really perform that well. The rice I sowed in May, you can see it looked better than the April rice, but the rice I sowed in June, first week of June, look at how much better the development is. So I had a better yield and I had more beautiful plants. So this lends itself to the idea that rice really likes heat. So you can tag me on social media. I'll be super excited to see that you've done this. Bring me great joy. And my last one is sorghum. So sorghum is the sweetness. It's also probably the most relevant grain for looking 50 years into the future. And actually, when Mary Poppins was singing about a spoonful of sugar, she was actually singing about sorghum syrup. It's really high in magnesium and manganese. Those were actually things that people were deficient of back in the day. And sorghum is the most heat-tolerant grain. It's a native of Africa. It's absolutely going to be something that is grown more commonly in the decades to come. It's also gluten-free. It grows quite tall, depending on the variety. There's a lot of different varieties of sorghum. So grain sorghum is a little different than cane sorghum. I grow both. I think you should too. And I really grow sorghum now as a bird feed supplement. The birds lose their minds. Like, I have the most birds of anybody in Wake County, and it's because of all the sorghum that I have been growing. But another really cool thing about sorghum is that you can actually see biocontrol in action. So frequently you will have aphid infestations on the leaves of sorghum, but it doesn't matter because you're not eating the leaves, so it doesn't impact the plant. If you let that happen, you'll have lady beetles that come and eat the aphids, and following that cycle, you will have viceroys that come and feed on the honeydew that the aphids left behind. And I think that is a really important lesson to remember, that you're not in control, but you are a steward, and that we have a responsibility for respecting all parts of our ecosystems. So some of the seed sources that I recommend for buying grains include everything here on this list. And you know, I frequently get the question of, like, what do you do with these grains? I think it's perfectly normal to grow these and just use them for decoration. They're quite beautiful. But we do grow them for the purpose of eating. I recommend the Wonder Mill if you're really gonna get into grinding your own grains. That'll do 2 cups of grain seed in 30 seconds. So it's very fast and efficient. We do make a lot of bread, as I mentioned, and it's just really important to recognize that homegrown is whole grain. So it's going to look different than the bread that you buy. Your flour is going to be a different color than, you know, the bleached white flour that you would purchase at the store. But that's what makes it special. And there's actually 13 recipes in Gardening with Grains, including gluten-free, vegetarian, and vegan recipes, so that you can make the most of your grain experience. And I thank you all so much for your time and attention today. I hope that I have gotten you excited about growing some grains. And while you're at it, grow okra and grains together, because now I'm obsessed with okra flour, so thanks, Chris. And you can visit my website to keep in touch. Here are the rest of my social media handles. And thank you to Soil³ for making this event possible.
Thank you, Brie. I accept your rice challenge. I already have a little packet, but I can see I'm going to have to buy a lot more. And one thing interesting I learned from both y'all yesterday and today was the importance for some of these warm season grasses and okra and other vegetables is just to wait another month. We were here at the end of April. It got really cold. That's where I live, the average frost-free day is April 15th, and it is based on an average because we maybe got a frost back home a couple nights ago. We certainly got one up here. We're kind of borderline zone 7A and 6B. So I love having permission to wait till later in May and June and not be in a panic about getting everything planted right now, so thank you. And with that, we conclude the Backyard Gardening Spring Edition. We will have this recording uploaded maybe by the end of the day, and we will send out an email on Monday with the links to both these recordings and your coupons. So thank you so much for joining us.